The firmament hanging over the valley of Redemption Creek had taken on the macabre hues of a deepening contusion. For 3 grueling days, the midsummer sun had functioned as a relentless mallet, pounding the desiccated, fractured landscape until the very soil seemed to cry out for reprieve. When the heavens finally fractured, however, they offered no salvation, only a concentrated malice. The creek, typically a sluggish, silver thread winding through the basin, transformed into a chocolate-colored, roiling leviathan. With a roar that shook the bedrock, it surged over its banks and effectively swallowed the town's civic center whole. From his solitary post atop the jagged northern ridge, a man named Nash observed the cataclysm. His expression remained unreadable, possessing the detached coldness of an individual who had grown intimately acquainted with the world's penchant for random, senseless brutality. Against the backdrop of that bruised, purple sky, he appeared as a stark black silhouette. He sat astride Diablo, a stallion as dark as a moonless midnight, and neither man nor beast flinched as the torrential rains lashed against them. Nash possessed no property in the valley, held no affection for its inhabitants, and had no reason to mourn the splintering timber and the desperate shrieks that were currently being drowned out by the thunderous water. He was merely a traveler, a phantom passing through as he had done 1,000 times before. Yet, amidst the monochrome desolation of mud and gray rain, a sudden spark of impossible color snagged his attention. A sliver of pale, delicate rose pink was caught against the splintered peak of a submerged saloon roof. Nash narrowed his eyes, his internal focus sharpening like a blade being drawn across a whetstone. It was a woman. Her dark tresses were plastered to her skull by the deluge, and the light fabric of her pink gown clung to her frame, making her look like a solitary, fragile petal caught in a vortex of filth and ruin. She was not wasting her breath on screams. Instead, she was anchored to the shingles, her knuckles bone-white from the strain, her body vibrating with a deep, bone-chilling tremor. Despite the terror, her posture remained strangely defiant, as if she were engaged in a silent, stubborn dispute with the elements themselves. Further out, Nash observed the flat-bottomed skiffs carrying the town's survivors. They were rowing frantically toward the safety of the distant, higher eastern bank. Not a single person in those boats turned their head. They had abandoned her to the rising tide. Nash didn't know the politics of their choice, nor did he care for the reasons behind their cowardice. Deep within his chest, an ember of a feeling he believed had been extinguished years ago began to glow. He gave Diablo a subtle nudge with his heels, a nuanced command the massive horse recognized instantly. The powerful animal transitioned from the stability of the ridge down into the chaotic, submerged labyrinth of the town's main street. The freezing current swirled around Diablo's hocks, then climbed to his chest, pulling and sucking at his mass with a hungry force. Nash sat with a mastery of balance, his center of gravity shifting in perfect harmony with the stallion's labored strides. His gaze remained locked on the woman. The world around them was a cacophony of structural collapse and rushing water, but in Nash's mind, there was only a singular, unwavering line connecting his soul to that rooftop. He was the legendary drifter, the feared gunslinger whose name was whispered in hushed tones from sun-bleached cantinas to the velvet-lined saloons of the coast. But in this singular moment, he was simply a man moving to intercept a life that was seconds away from being snuffed out. The trek back to his high-altitude cabin was a grueling, saturated odyssey through a geography that seemed to be weeping. The worst of the tempest had moved on, leaving behind a sky that looked scrubbed raw and a forest dripping with a heavy, rhythmic sorrow. The woman sat before him on the saddle, enveloped in the heavy folds of his dry oilskin coat. Her small frame was rigid, a concentrated mass of physiological shock and lingering dread. Nash could feel the rhythmic, fine vibrations of her shivering against his own body, yet she remained perfectly silent, no whimpering, no sobbing, not even a heavy sigh. The silence that stretched between them felt as vast as the mountains themselves, punctuated only by the rhythmic squelch of Diablo's hooves in the muck and the mournful plinking of water falling from broken branches. Nash found himself wondering about her. She was a creature of fine silk and almond-shaped eyes, clearly a world away from this frontier of timber and mud. Why had she come here? And why had the very people she likely served left her to drown? By the time the isolated cabin, tucked away in the high, craggy foothills, came into view, the final rays of a dying sun were washing the mountains in a palette of bruised gold and deep amethyst. The structure was utilitarian and rugged, fashioned from seasoned pine and smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and the heavy scent of solitude. It functioned as a fortress, not a residence. Nash dismounted first, his heavy boots sinking into the saturated earth, and then reached up to retrieve her. For a heartbeat, she paused, her dark eyes meeting his. In that gaze, Nash saw more than just the residue of fear. He saw an analytical, intelligent light. With a soft, controlled exhale, she allowed him to lift her down. As soon as her feet touched the ground, her knees buckled, her endurance finally reaching its limit. He caught her, his steady arm providing the necessary anchor, and for a fleeting second, she leaned her weight against his chest. She felt lighter than a whispered secret. Once inside, Nash coaxed a fire into existence within the stone hearth. The orange flames licked the air, throwing long, erratic shadows across the rough-cut walls. He draped a thick, coarse wool blanket over her shoulders. "You are out of danger here," he remarked, his voice sounding gravelly and strange from long periods of disuse. She shifted her gaze from the dancing embers to his face, her stare unwavering. "Why?" The word was barely a breath, yet it carried the immense weight of the last few hours. Nash contemplated the inquiry, knowing the real answer was a tangled knot he couldn't yet unravel. No living thing should be forced to meet their end in that manner, he responded simply. He gestured for her to take the small bed, a modest cot in the corner of the single room. He established his own position on a bedroll by the heavy timber door, his sidearm resting within easy reach. He was not her jailer, but her sentry. As the interior of the cabin grew heavy with the warmth of the hearth and the rhythmic, softening sound of her breathing, Nash felt a microscopic hairline fracture appear in the armor of ice that had protected his heart for a decade. The following morning arrived with the clarity of a new world. Sharp, brilliant sunlight pierced the cabin's lone window, turning the floating dust motes into dancing specks of gold. When Nash stirred, he found she was already upright, standing by the threshold and staring out across the verdant valley. The rose-pink dress was a tattered, mud-stained casualty of the storm, but she had scrubbed the grime from her skin and woven her long, obsidian hair into a neat braid. In the crisp morning air, she possessed a quiet, enduring beauty that seemed to stand in direct defiance of the previous day's carnage. Nash rose and tended to the fire, setting a pot of coffee to boil. He offered her a tin mug, which she accepted with a small, dignified inclination of her head. They consumed the bitter liquid in a profound silence, the mountain of unasked questions hovering between them like the morning fog clinging to the cedar boughs. Later that morning, Nash went out to fix a stretch of perimeter fencing that the wind had toppled. He worked with a practiced, efficient economy of motion, his calloused hands stretching the wire with a strength born of years of solitary toil. He was acutely aware of her presence on the porch, her eyes following his movements. After an hour had passed, she stepped off the porch and walked toward a small, neglected patch of earth that Nash had once attempted to turn into a garden. It was currently a disaster of weeds and battered vegetable stalks. She knelt in the dirt, and with a focused tenderness that seemed almost liturgical, her slender fingers began to probe the soil. She methodically removed the invasive weeds and gently staked a collapsed tomato plant, her touch acting as a restorative balm for the wounded greenery. Nash paused in his labor, mesmerized. She moved with a sense of grace and inherent purpose that he found utterly magnetic. He eventually brought her a dipper of cool water from the well. She drank, her eyes offering a silent thank you over the rim of the ladle. Then, she opened her hand. Resting in her palm was a single, vibrant wild strawberry, a tiny, crimson gemstone. It was a peace offering, a bridge of trust. He took it, the brief contact of their skin sending a strange, sharp jolt through his nerves. He ate the fruit, and the sweetness seemed to explode against his senses. "Lynn," she said, her voice melodic and clear. She gestured to herself. Then she looked up at him, her head tilted in silent inquiry. "Nash," he answered. The sound of his own name felt foreign, a word he hadn't claimed in a very long time. She whispered it back, "Nash." It didn't sound like a name to him, it sounded like a quiet invocation. He gave a sharp, unpracticed nod. An identity had been shared. A connection had been sown in the quiet earth between them. A week drifted by. The fence was restored to its full integrity, and under Lynn's meticulous care, the garden began to flourish with green vitality. However, their larder was becoming dangerously thin. A trip to Blackwood, the nearest settlement that had escaped the flooding, became a necessity. Nash saddled Diablo and assisted Lynn in mounting behind him. Her hands gripped his waist lightly, providing a constant, radiating warmth against his back. As they trotted onto the dusty main thoroughfare of Blackwood, a heavy, oppressive silence descended upon the town. Every resident paused, their eyes tracking the pair. They recognized Nash. They knew the dark folklore surrounding him, the tales of men he had sent to the graveyard with a flick of his wrist. His very aura seemed to chill the summer air. But it was the presence of Lynn, her striking, non-local features and her inherent poise, that shifted their fear into something uglier, suspicion and blatant prejudice. Whispers trailed them like carrion flies. Nash felt Lynn's posture stiffen against his back, but she did not bow her head. When they dismounted at the general store, she walked at his side with her chin held high, a small, regal island in a sea of sneering faces. Inside, the proprietor, a bloated man with small, avaricious eyes, watched them approach the counter with visible distaste. "What can I do for you, Nash?" he grunted, pointedly refusing to acknowledge Lynn's existence. Nash placed a small leather pouch of silver on the wood. "Flour, salt, coffee beans." The merchant's gaze flickered to Lynn, a greasy, mocking smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Looks like you went fishing in the flood and caught yourself some foreign debris." Nash didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply locked eyes with the man. There was no overt snarl, no reaching for a weapon, just a cold, absolute vacuum of stillness that promised a very specific kind of violence. It was a look that had paralyzed hardened outlaws. The merchant's smirk died instantly. He swallowed hard, his fake bravado vanishing under that lethal pressure. He began to weigh out the flour with trembling, clumsy hands. Lynn observed the entire exchange. She had seen Nash's quiet gentleness at the cabin. Now, for the first time, she was witnessing the terrifying weight of his reputation. She realized that he didn't use this darkness for himself, but as a bulwark for her. He was the wall standing between her and the malice of the world. Her heart ached with a sudden, profound surge of gratitude and wonder. As they were lashing the crates to Diablo's saddle, a long shadow stretched across the dirt. "Well, well. Look at what the river coughed up." The voice was resonant and slick with unearned authority. Nash turned with agonizing slowness. Standing there was Barlow, a man who controlled half the valley's resources and behaved as if he owned the souls of the people living on them. He was a massive, bull-necked individual, flanked by 2 armed retainers. His expensive silks were dusted with the grime of his own ego. His eyes ignored Nash, fixing instead on Lynn with a look of crude, commercial appraisal. "I never took you for a man who kept exotic pets, Nash," Barlow drawled, a sadistic grin playing on his features. "Where do you find her?" "She must have rode a long way from home." Nash stepped slightly in front of Lynn. A subtle but definitive act of territorial protection. His hand hovered near the hilt of his revolver. "She's with me, Barlow." "Leave it be." Barlow let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Is she now? Everything in this valley has a tag on it, one way or another. What's the price for the girl?" I'm looking for something new to decorate my porch. The atmosphere became thick enough to choke on. The onlookers retreated further into the shadows, sensing the coming storm. Lynn's hand instinctively gripped the fabric of Nash's shirt, her knuckles pressing into the small of his back. He felt that tiny touch, and it anchored him, focusing the glacial rage that was coiling in his chest. "She is not a commodity," Nash said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating whisper. "And she is not for sale." Barlow's eyes narrowed into slits. He was unaccustomed to the word no. He viewed Nash's defense of the woman not as a matter of honor, but as a direct affront to his power. "Every person has a price," he sneered, taking a menacing step forward. "And everyone is replaceable." The threat was naked. He wasn't just talking about Lynn anymore. He was threatening Nash's very right to exist in the valley. The gauntlet had been thrown down in the dirt of Blackwood. The journey back to the foothills was fraught with tension, the silence heavy with the impending retribution they knew was coming. Barlow was not the type to let a public snub go unpunished. The first strike came 48 hours later. As Nash was returning from checking his rabbit snares, a rider erupted from the tree-line, discharging a rifle into the air to panic the horse. But Diablo was a warhorse at heart. He stood like granite. Nash, with a fluid, terrifying grace, drew his iron and fired a single, surgical shot that shattered the wood of the rider's rifle, spinning it out of his hands. The gunman, one of Barlow's thugs, stared at his stinging, empty palms in shock before fleeing back into the brush. Nash didn't give chase. The warning had been delivered. However, Barlow's cruelty was more systematic than a simple ambush. A few days later, the mountain stream that fed Nash's property, their only source of life, dwindled to a trickle and then vanished. Nash followed the dry bed upstream for a mile until he found the obstruction, a massive, crudely engineered dam of timber and boulders diverting the flow onto Barlow's sprawling cattle range. It was a slow execution by thirst. A cold spark of panic tried to take root in Nash's heart, but he crushed it. The fear was for Lynn, not himself. He returned to find her standing by an empty water barrel, her face set in a grim mask. "The water," she said. It wasn't a question. "Barlow," Nash confirmed. She gave a short nod, her eyes wandering to the thirsty, drooping plants in her garden. For a fleeting second, Nash saw a flicker of hopelessness in her expression, but it was quickly replaced by a steely, internal resolve that mirrored his own. That evening, she demonstrated a different kind of strength. She showed him how to extract moisture from the world around them, harvesting morning dew from broad leaves and locating dampness hidden deep beneath the shaded overhangs of rocks. Her knowledge of the natural world was a quiet, practical miracle. Her refusal to be broken solidified Nash's own spirit. They would not be starved out by one man's avarice. He knew a head-on assault against Barlow's ranch would be a suicide mission, but he could not allow them to perish. The dam had to be destroyed. Under the thin, silver hook of a crescent moon, Nash made his preparations. He was tightening the cinches on Diablo's saddle when a soft voice emerged from the cabin doorway. "I am coming with you." It was Lynn. She had traded her ruined dress for a pair of Nash's old trousers and a dark, charcoal shirt. "No," Nash said, his tone ironclad. "It's too hazardous. Come with me." It wasn't an order to perform a chore, it was an invitation. Mai put on her thin coat, wrapped her scarf around her head, and followed him into the blinding radiance of the new snow. He didn't lead her toward the traps or the well. Instead, he headed away from the cabin, marching toward the high, windswept ridge that served as the western boundary of their small valley. The ascent was grueling, the snow reaching their knees in places. Amos carved the path, his powerful legs moving with a tireless rhythm. He never paused to check if she was keeping pace, he simply knew she was there. They reached the crest just as the morning sun broke over the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, drenching the world in liquid gold. My gasped, her lungs burning from the exertion and the thin, biting air. Amos stood at the precipice, staring out at the horizon. He waited for her to join him at the edge. This was the revelation. She stepped up beside him, and her breath caught. Below them, unfolding as far as the eye could possibly reach, was not a continuation of the desolate plains, but a massive, hidden sanctuary. A wide river, a ribbon of dark, churning water, snaked through the valley floor, its banks lined with ancient cottonwoods that stood like guardians against the white. And scattered across that vast expanse, grazing quietly in the winter light, were cattle. There weren't dozens, or even hundreds. There were thousands. They appeared as tiny obsidian specks against the snow, a sprawling monument to an immense, secret fortune. Tucked into a protective bend of the river was a massive ranch house, constructed of dark, sturdy timber and river stone. Corrals and outbuildings fanned out from the main structure like a small, private city. Bold plumes of smoke rose from several chimneys, drifting confidently into the blue sky. In the ensuing mayhem, Nash grabbed Lynn, and they vanished into the darkness, leaving Barlow's hirelings to stare at the wreckage of their employer's malice. The return of the water was a celebration. The gurgling song of the creek filled the valley once more, and Lynn's garden drank until the leaves turned a deep, healthy emerald. But their victory was not without social cost. In Blackwood, a humiliated Barlow began to poison the collective mind of the town. He fabricated a narrative of a violent outlaw and a foreign sorceress who used dark arts to trigger landslides. He painted Nash as a public threat and Lynn as an unnatural, dangerous presence. Fear was a potent toxin, and the townspeople drank it deep. The whispers became overt accusations. Troublemaker, they spat when Nash entered the store. Witch, they hissed at Lynn, pulling their children away as if her very shadow were contagious. The isolation that had once been Nash's choice was now a cage built by others. Yet, something extraordinary happened in the heat of that shared persecution. The more the world pushed them away, the more they gravitated toward one another. Their silences became deeper, more comfortable, and filled with a perfect, unspoken language. The cabin, once a place of solitary confinement for a lonely man, was becoming a sanctuary for two people. One evening, the local physician, a weary but honorable man named Alistair, rode up to the cabin. Nash met him on the porch, hand on his holster. "I'm not looking for a fight, son," Alistair said, raising his palms. "I just wanted to see if the lady was well. I've heard Barlow's lies. I don't believe a word of them." He had seen Lynn's dignity in the street, and he remembered the time Nash had quietly recovered his stolen medical bag without asking for a cent. In a town drowning in fear, one man chose to remain tethered to reality. It was a single candle in a dark room, but it was enough to keep the shadows at bay. As the seasons shifted, the nights grew crisp, and the fire in the hearth became the warm, golden heart of their existence. One night, as they sat before the flames, the day's labor behind them, the silence in the cabin felt like a vessel waiting to be filled. Nash watched the firelight dance across Lynn's face, highlighting the strength of her jaw and the intelligent depth in her eyes. He realized he had saved her from a flood, but she had saved him from a drought of the soul. "I was alone for a very long time," he began, the confession feeling like a heavy weight being lifted. "I convinced myself that was how I was meant to live." Lynn turned her gaze from the fire to him, her eyes inviting him to speak the rest. The silence here, it used to just be an empty space. But now... He paused, struggling with the vulnerability. She reached across the gap between them, her small, warm hand covering his calloused one. The contact felt like a lightning strike. Pure, undiluted emotion. "Now," she whispered, finishing his thought, "it is not empty." He looked down at their joined hands, her delicate fingers woven through his scarred ones. It felt like the only thing in the world that made sense. He looked back into her eyes. "This is your home, Lynn," he said, his voice thick. If you want it. If you want me. Tears shimmered in her eyes like starlight, but they were not born of pain. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face. My home, she said, her voice trembling with conviction, is wherever you are, Nash. He brought her hand to his lips, a gesture of absolute devotion and a silent vow. The void was gone. The silence was finally full of love. Their wedding was not a public spectacle. It was a private covenant, witnessed by the ancient peaks and a sky the color of bluebells. Dr. Alistair officiated, his voice steady as he read from a tattered book. The town blacksmith, a man of few words and much respect, stood as Nash's witness. Lynn wore a gown of deep twilight blue she had stitched herself, carrying a bundle of wildflowers from the high meadow. Nash stood taller than he ever had, his eyes never straying from her. The vows they exchanged were simple and direct, promises made not to a congregation, but to each other's souls. It was a bond forged in floodwater and fire, in shared struggle and silent understanding. Barlow, his power broken after his petty cruelty failed to destroy them, became nothing more than a bitter, ignored ghost. The decent folk of Blackwood, led by the doctor and the smith, eventually turned their backs on his hatred. They didn't fully embrace Nash and Lynn immediately, but they offered a quiet, grudging respect, an acknowledgement of a love that had weathered a storm of prejudice. The final image of their journey is one of profound peace. Several months later, they stand together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, painting the horizon in strokes of fire and rose. The garden is a lush, thriving testament to their care. Nash's arm is draped around her shoulders, a steady, protective weight, and her head rests against his chest. They don't need words. They simply watch the day conclude, certain in the knowledge that when the sun rises tomorrow, they will face it as one. They had found each other in the wreckage of a broken world and had constructed a new one, a world for two, built on the bedrock of courage, acceptance, and a love as enduring as the mountains themselves.